Okay, hello everybody. Wow, that sounds loud. Hello, I'm Neil Woods. I suppose you could call me the first host of today's event. So really I should say a welcome to everybody. Before COVID, I would never have considered planning an event which was primarily online. It feels quite strange, and I obviously do a lot of public speaking, and to actually be speaking mostly to the ether is really quite strange. So really, I suppose I should say a welcome to everyone who is listening, because we have an audience spread over 3 continents. So a special welcome to those in North America and Africa, and whoever it is from the Netherlands Police Academy. Hello, I bet I know you, so hi. And we also have 17 different police forces represented, so you are all very, very welcome indeed. And just before I start properly with the words I've got to say today, just want to make the point that today will raise more questions than it answers, because this is to a degree the beginning of addressing an urgent need. And with reference to those questions that people will have in their heads as a result of today, I'm part of a very dedicated team who are working on finding the solutions to those answers. We will be thinking about how to solve problems, how to design systems. We're working on all of those kind of things. But with that in mind, we need more research, we need more information. So all of the audience that's listening here today, wherever you may be, if you would be so kind as to commit yourselves to responding when we ask you for access, because some research is about to be started, and that research is going to be much more detailed and more accurate if we have the access. And please bear in mind that what we're trying to do is to actually solve some of your problems. And so if you're part of that problem-solving system where you're helping us provide the data to help us, then those solutions will be more wider reaching. So thank you for that. So why am I part of this? Well, when I started as a police officer in 1989, when I started in the Derbyshire Constabulary, within the first 2 weeks of starting, my tutor showed me this world of grim humour, which I've learned to love quite quickly. Grim humour within the police, it's a way, sort of response to dealing with what's going on. And I remember within the first 2 weeks, my tutor said to me, "We have quite a good pension, but when they ask you, you need to make sure that you take your lump sum rather than try and spread your pension over many years. And the reason for that is we haven't got that long to spend it. Because on average, when you retire as a police officer, you've only got 7 years to live." And he was joking about it, but he was referring actually to a study that had been done in the 1980s, which was a sort of comparative study of how long people survive after they retire from any particular profession. And policing, by a long way, came out worst. And it compared very unfavourably in survival rates with other high-pressure jobs like paramedic or other emergency responders. So he made light of that, and I made light of that. But I was appreciative, if I'm honest, that sort of grim humour could help me unpick it. But as it happened, I did end up getting PTSD, like many police do. Now, during that grim humour, I wasn't really given any indication about how to alter what might happen to me, what might, to my mental health. But as I say, the humour did help. So I'm diagnosed with complex PTSD. I'm also diagnosed with moral injury. And the combination of those two things can make it really messy. Very messy indeed. It took many, many years to even understand what was going on. It took 3 psychiatrists, multiple psychiatric nurses, therapists, community psychiatric nurses, and learning to live with all sorts of symptoms. My condition is chronic, which means I've had to learn to adapt, and I still have symptoms. I still have times of disassociation and hypervigilance, extreme anxiety. Many gifts that PTSD keeps giving. But there's some interesting facts that we need to establish, I think, about PTSD, especially in a policing context. Now, I only learned some of these facts within the last 2 or 3 years after my diagnosis. So there is a collection of issues which are a comorbidity with PTSD. So for example, as a chronic PTSD, someone who has complex PTSD, I'm twice as likely to die of a stroke. I'm also twice as likely to die from heart disease. I am twice as likely to have high cholesterol. I'm also extremely more likely to be subject to suicide, a victim of suicide. Now these comorbidities are serious, and it refers me back really to the grim humour of my tutor when he said, well, the average cop's only got 7 years to live. Well, herein lies your explanation, because the explanation was never offered at that time. PTSD has an extraordinary collection of illnesses through comorbidity, which means that PTSD is a serious illness. It's a serious illness that you may not survive. And that's how we need to be seeing it. And if you do survive it, the odds are that you will have 10 years shaved off your life. I'm at the moment looking to see that apparently I'm going to have to increase my statins to reduce my cholesterol. You know, my blood pressure this week was 163/81. You know, 20 more on there and I have to go to the emergency room. And these are only because of my PTSD, because I run for 2 hours at a time, my diet is perfect, I cut salt out obsessively. This is because of my mental illness. And we are not seeing the impact of this illness. Of course, I'm only concentrating on PTSD. There are other mental health conditions which are associated with or can be developed through the stress from policing. So, why does that average of 7 years suddenly make sense when you consider those things? Well, there was a study, and it's an incredible study because it involved 18,000 cops. It's the best study on the mental health of police that's ever been done in the world, as far as I can see. It was a UK study from 2018. I'm not going to bore you with all the stats from it, because stats bore me. But there's a very important statistic from that, and it concluded from that study that 20% of British police have some form of PTSD, and the majority do not know it. Half of the rest that are not, that don't have PTSD, have precursor symptoms that may well be on the way to leading towards PTSD, such as hypervigilance and certain types of anxiety. So this is a huge problem, especially when you consider the seriousness of the illness and with the comorbidities. But it's also a problem for many other reasons, not least of which to the poor cops who may have to be retired ill or lose their career. It's also a political problem, and it should be seen as a political problem and a political crisis. I think anyone listening to this will be aware that there is a crisis within policing and a political crisis, because certainly in the UK, the United States, and definitely in France as well, there is a constant stream of stories criticising police, or police have got into trouble for this behaviour or that behaviour, whether they've been accused of misogyny or that they've been too violent or they've responded to something in the wrong way. Now, this is important because, from a political point of view, because if people lose confidence in the police, that's a serious problem for society, right? Any politician is going to tell you that. Certainly any chief constable is going to tell you that, because the number one priority or directive from a Home Minister to a chief constable is you need to maintain public confidence. That's your number one. So it's a huge issue. But why is the mental health linked to that? Well, I'm not here trying to make excuses for the poor behaviour of any individual police officer. I'm not. If any officer behaves badly or commits a criminal act, of course, that should be dealt with appropriately. But what is appropriate? Because at the moment, individual officers are being attacked without any context at all as to their mental health or the situation or circumstances which have led to that behaviour. And what I mean by that is we know that PTSD changes behaviour. We know this. We know that it is more likely, it increases temper. It's more likely for someone to lose their temper. It interferes with decision-making processes. And if it's one thing a cop needs, it's his decision-making processes working perfectly well. She needs to be able to think clearly. Now, I speak on this topic. I've spoken all over the world. I speak on various policy issues, but I also speak about mental health. And because I've done it in the media, I get contacted by police officers who are very grateful that I've made an attempt to break down the stigma by being honest about it. They're grateful because the stigma is huge. The stigma is huge in society, but I would argue it is significantly worse within policing. Now, there's one thing that all of these cops that have got in touch with me, they have in common lots of things, but one of the things they have in common is that where they've had a problem with their mental health and they've either had to go off sick or they've had problems with their work, every single one of them has been treated with hostility. Every single one of them. I certainly was. When I had my mental health crisis, well, I suppose it began when I was still at work in 2009. It had probably been creeping up to that point. Eventually, my work started to suffer, and I wasn't functioning as the organisation would want me to. Now, I have a history of a collection of unfortunate instances which have led to my PTSD, and it shouldn't have taken any manager or anybody really very long to work out what was going on, where the cause and effect was. But no one considered that at all. And that's very common everywhere. So I'm not just picking on my former constabulary. I'm saying this is a systematic problem, not just here in the UK, but all over the world. And I have lots of anecdotal evidence from very many people about that. Now, a good friend of mine who's become a good friend, one of these people who contacted me after I went public, is a guy called Nick Castle, a good friend of mine. Now, Nick, like many police, had multiple layers of traumas, things that he's experienced. But the thing about PTSD is if you have one big trauma and then you have many other traumas layered on top, it's like, one psychiatrist described it to me as the death of 1,000 cuts, which is a rather unfortunate sort of phrase, but it does explain it, that there is a layering here, a layering that no other profession really gets, because police are having to deal with traumatised people and traumatising things all of the time. And if you're not able to recover from the one, then it makes it very difficult to be resilient to the second and the third and so on. Now, Nick Castle, he was attacked by a drug dealing gang. He used to work undercover. He was attacked by a drug dealing gang and he was beaten so badly that he was left on the floor unconscious with a broken back. And his broken back was complicated, and to this day he has to have fentanyl pain patches every day. But he also has PTSD, very, very severe PTSD, of the dissociative type particularly. His PTSD is so bad that he can't leave the house without his support dog. And one time when he did leave the house without that dog, he ended up disassociating and losing months of his life. That's how severe his problem is. So his dog will shout at him and jump on him if he senses him going into a dissociative state. Now, Nick has a similar diagnosis to me in that he has CPTSD but also moral injury. So for him, he has these instances where his near-death experiences, like he was beaten, but he also has an instance where he was told by his sergeant to always stop search this particular drug user every single time when he saw him. It was part of a scheme that used to exist in the UK where we treated persistent priority offenders differently. We always targeted them. So Nick, being a very good, hard-working police officer, did exactly as his sergeant said, and he searched him every time. When this young problematic drug user committed suicide, he named Nick Castle as being a contributory factor, that PC Castle. So even though Nick suffers from all of these serious injuries and all of the trauma of near-death experience, the thing that troubles him, his mental health the most, is that moral injury. So we need to be thinking about moral injury very, very carefully, because we're not doing at the moment. And moral injury can be layered, multi-layered, in the same way that other forms of PTSD can be. And I raise this in particular because police have been asked to do more and more and more over the last few years. And one of the most significant things they've been asked to do is to police the protesting. Now, in many nations around the world, the UK, Australia, many places, have brought in legislation to get ahead of anticipated public order problems because of the climate crisis. And we're seeing these things starting to play out now. Now, if the people who've designed those policies and those legislations haven't considered the impact on the mental health of police tasked to police these protests, well, they're not doing their job, and I know they haven't. Because there's so many times you'll see on social media some retired 72-year-old doctor who decides that they want to do their thing for the planet, for their grandchildren, being arrested by police for blocking the road. We need to be considering the impact on the officers' mental health, because moral injury is multi-layered. So I bring you back to the impact, the political impact. So another friend of mine who's now a friend of mine, who contacted me, Matt. Now, Matt has a different type, a different flavour, if you like, of PTSD. Now, of all of the things that PTSD has given me, the times of suicidal ideation, anxiety, all of the nasty things it gave me, I am really, really glad that I do not have one of the symptoms that is quite common. And that is an extreme temper. Now, my former colleague, Matt, that is one of his symptoms, an extreme temper. To the extent that he can't go into a medical appointment unless he is escorted by somebody, because the doctors and psychiatric nurses are scared of him. Now, I knew Matt as a cop. He was a gentle soul. He was a genuinely brilliant detective who cared very, very passionately about his job, and especially trying to get justice for sexual violence victims, especially. He's a good guy. But then he drove a car into a wall when things got too much for him, and he was treated with the same kind of stigma, suspicion, contempt. And again, he had a history. He was the first on the scene of a nightclub shooting, got there and someone pointed a gun at him, and that was the first of many multiple layers of trauma that he'd suffered, which had taken him on a long journey into driving a car into a wall. And like me, like most of us, he got no support. He got support from the Federation, of course. Federation were great for me, but it's a limited window. Then when you've got years and years and years of trying to even get a diagnosis and understand what's going on, there is no support. But Matt's example is really, really important, because when I talked about PTSD interfering with decision making, well, how does that fit into someone like Matt, who suddenly from nowhere developed an extreme temper? So the point is that if there is evidence, which there is, that this job creates an extreme risk of PTSD, which there is evidence, then the firm, the police service, needs to be considering the ethics of this. Because if a police officer loses his temper as a result of that illness, at the moment, all of the weight of responsibility of that is on the officer, all of it, both institutionally, legally, whatever. What we are arguing here, if we're arguing nothing else, is that ethical consideration should be weighted towards the organisation. Because we know the risk, we know the symptoms, we know the net result of developing PTSD is poor decision making, decisions going wrong, and a temper. So whose ethical responsibility is it? I would argue it's the ethical responsibility of the constabulary. And if anyone listening to me disagrees with that, well, consider Matt. He has to be escorted to his medical appointments to see the doctor by somebody. Is that his fault? Is that his fault? In Norway, they have by law risk assessments, like we do in the UK. Lots of police supervisors pull their hair out going through a risk assessment and making sure they've covered everything. In Norway, they have to consider the impact on the mental health by law. Now, the police service is the only institution in Norway that is exempt from having to implement that risk assessment, advisory, warning, whatever it is. But they have to consider it by law, which puts the pressure on the organisation to say, okay, you've acknowledged this risk, but you're saying the cops have to do it anyway. So the question becomes, well, what are you going to do to mitigate that risk? As far as I know, Norway is the only place that has that. I actually think we need to go further than that, but it's not a bad start. Now, in the UK, it takes 7 years on average to be diagnosed with PTSD. It's no different for police officers, no different. We know that the earlier you diagnose PTSD, you have significantly higher chances of recovering from it completely and significantly higher chances of mitigating the impact of it, significantly. Now, my mate Nick has been told, now he can't work, he knows he's never going to work again. He got diagnosed as a relatively young man. That was it, life over, he can't work. He's been told that if his was diagnosed very early, he would have had a good chance of working again. But 7 years is before you get diagnosed. So consider, we're losing staff to mental illness, but if we diagnose them early, or we considered their well-being to prevent the descent into mental illness, now, I've not seen a cost-benefit analysis, but I bet it wouldn't take much work to suggest a significant investment in mental health would actually save resources and finances. And you need to, especially now that we consider that at this moment, in this day now, more officers in the UK resign than retire. And we're having this situation where we now have we're soon to have half the police in the UK at under 3 years service. So why have we got to this situation? We quite often, the opposition to what myself and other people are saying is that we haven't got a new problem of mental health, we've always had it, we're just better at detecting it. Well, we might be better at detecting it, but the problem is dramatically more than it was, and it's going in one direction. So 700 sick days, 700,000 sick days in the last 12 months, which is twice what it was 10 years ago. Twice what it was. And that's a significant increase, and it's only going in one direction. It's going to continue to get worse. So there are 5, I think I got this right, 5 sick days per every serving cop each year, and 4 out of 5 those 5 days are for mental health problems. That was not the same 10 years ago. But why? Why is it suddenly happened in the last 10 years? Well, for most of my life, nowadays I'm an activist, so I try and stay really, really impartial. I try not to point the finger anywhere, I use very diplomatic language, but I'm afraid in the UK I have to point the finger. Austerity has significantly damaged policing in this country. The responsibility really does lie in the hands of our government. Because in that survey I made reference to, where that stated that 20% of cops have got PTSD, there were some really interesting conclusions from that study. It said that, for one, a resilience to PTSD can be found if individual officers find that their job is worthwhile and meaningful. Meaningful is a very important term in unpicking this, meaningful. But also, mitigating factors, protective factors if you've got experience around you. Now, we have many places in the UK where a sergeant has 3 years service. Now, I know most of those will be highly talented people, very dynamic. But at least back in my days when I joined, I had a shift of long in the tooth people. I always knew there were people around me who'd been there before, who'd seen this before, who knew the answers to these questions. It is a significant contributor to stress to be so young in service. But we are stuck with this situation. We've damaged police for a generation. There's no getting around that. Austerity has been a disaster for policing. So if we are stuck with this damage, we have to be rapidly thinking how we can deal with it. And so, which is the reason why we've brought this event together today. There are a few of us we've done work on this around the world. With the organisation Leap Europe, we had an event at the United Nations just in March where we addressed the problem of police mental health. We've got coverage all over the world. We did. We spoke about it in the Netherlands Training Academy in January. But we need to speed up because this is worse than it sounds. This direction of travel is going to cause significant problems. So, meaningfulness. This is a significant word. It's a significant word because it's a word that came out of the collective evidence of this study in 2018. So we can't ignore it. We have to act on it because it's one of the findings of the best study on this topic that's been done. Which is why I'm pleased that part of today's event is going to be Cranston, and I'll introduce you to them shortly. Because meaningfulness, let me compare something to you. Ask any cop what a frustration is that upsets them, who works on the streets, is when they say, well, I'm just locking up the same people, doing the same thing, time and time again. This collection of people who are using heroin problematically, or they're using crack, or they're using alcohol, and they're shoplifting, they're doing petty crimes, they're being exploited by organised crime to deal, and they keep getting arrested, they keep getting sent to prison, they keep doing like 6 weeks in prison, they're back out. And in fact, when they get sent to prison, drugs are 4 times more expensive in prison. So you send someone to prison, then you're building up debt for them, which they have to pay off quickly when they come out because it's accruing interest. So sending someone to prison is only adding to the crime. It's a very basic fact of the reality of our drug policy. So that's meaningless. It's frustrating. It's upsetting to cops on the street who are trying to deal with a problem, who are busy. There are alternatives which have a very, very strong evidence base. We'll hear more from Cranston about that. But today is about thinking about a collection of solutions. It's mostly about asking the questions and for us to raise awareness. Now, as I said, I'm part of a team who are trying to develop the responses to these questions. And at the end of today, we will have a look to the future. Our last panel will be a look to the future and what we can do about it. So I'll keep most of the comments about what the future looks like till then. But I would just invite you through the day as we listen to the conversations and these excellent speakers that we brought together today. How can these conversations fit into my workplace? How can I feed into the evidence base? How can we work together to actually change around? Because we have to change culture, we have to reduce the stigma, but part of that is actually working out the solutions and educating our own teams and our own institutions that everybody has to buy into this. Everybody. Because I remember Nick Castle saying to me, I had lots of sympathy when I got my back broken. Everybody came to find me. Everybody. Everybody came to ask me how I was. Everybody came to show sympathy and understanding. But when I disassociated and drove my car into incoming traffic, I was a pariah. Nobody spoke to me. Nobody. And arguably, his mental health injury was much worse than his broken back. So, on that note, we're not doing questions yet, are we? So, if you do have any burning questions, we're going to have a short break for a few questions in a while, but mostly we're going to direct your questions to the panel at the very end. So, thank you for listening to me, but now I'm going to, I'll let the good Cranston people come and introduce themselves, but I'm going to hand over to our wonderful allies and friends from Cranston.